Welcome back to Access and Arc, the MEA Institute podcast where we unpack the forces shaping the Middle East and Africa through youth-driven dialogue. In today's episode, our communications associate Ahmed Amuchikmula sat down with Karl Theus and Nicole Weber to explore the topic of GCC defense in light of the Iran war and dive deeper into a special edition report they co-authored, from patron to partner, Rethinking the Gulf Defense After the Iran War. Here is that interview.
Hello and welcome. Today I'm joined by Karl Theus and Nicole Weber, both research fellows at the MEA Institute for Strategic Studies, and two of the co-authors of the recent special edition report, From Patron to Partner, Rethinking Gulf Defense After the Iran War. The report looks at how the current war has exposed major weaknesses in the Gulf model of security, particularly in the region's reliance on U.S. protection, the vulnerability of critical infrastructure, and the difficult choices now facing GCC states. Karl's work focuses on the structural side, Gulf security architecture, and why deeper regional defense cooperation remains difficult. Nicole's work brings in the legal dimension, looking at international law, infrastructure, targeting, and how existing norms are being challenged. Thank you both very much for joining. So I want to start by stepping back a little before we get into the details. What has fundamentally changed in Gulf security as a result of this conflict? So maybe, Karl, you can start us off, and Nicole, to have you right after.
Of course. Well, what has changed? I would say almost everything has changed. With this conflict, the Arabic Gulf states, have been drawn into a conflict which they did not want. However, due to their closeness with the United States, they were drawn into, which is especially ironic, let's put it this way, given that the Gulf states maintained and still maintain such a close relationship with the US in order to ensure their own safety. Now, this conflict has shown that the United States, when it starts conflicts, is either unwilling or unable to protect its allies in the Gulf region to the standard that, well, its regional partners expected. Yes, that's just a short introduction. I'll give the word to Nicole.
Yeah, I can just continue saying the same thing, that the GCC states basically stopped being reliant on the US, or basically they shifted their trust. It doesn't mean that the GCC states are unwilling to continue the partnership with the US. It just means that the GCC states are, or understood that they cannot rely fully on the US. But it doesn't mean that they also will find another partner to protect themselves, but it means that they need to find another solution on how to structure their security. And that's not the only problem, but it's also the problem of how to maintain within the GCC, how those states can maintain security architecture even or despite their political differences. And that, I think, will be a reoccurring issue that goes on, that went on for a long time and will go on for a long time. We will see if they will unite or if they will defer. But what is clear is that they are definitely willing to find another solution, this other than the US protectorate.
Thank you both. And I think you both made this point that this didn't happen overnight. And it's building over time. And as you said, Nicole, as well, it won't stop here as well. So let me ask and start with Nicole by, when do you think it actually became clear that the existing Gulf security model was no longer sufficient?
So it became clear when GCC states stopped being only the protected objects of the regional security model and when they actually became like pressure points inside the US-Iran confrontation, because the traditional Gulf security model was based on the US as the external security guarantor, while the GCC states would actually rely on that protection to secure like their territory or the energy infrastructure. But with this crisis, it showed the weakness of that arrangement, because Iran's pressure is not directed only at the US, but now also at the Gulf, precisely because the Gulf is where the US protection is like materially located. So the problem is not that the US is absent, but more of that the US protection itself makes the GCC part of that conflict. So Iran can pressure like basically the US indirectly by targeting or threatening the Gulf security or shipping infrastructure and economic stability. So basically, the GCC condemned this attack because it doesn't only threat GCC countries, but it's also threatening global security, which also confirms that the GCC is not like only peripheral, but it's also directly exposed in that conflict.
As you mentioned, the weakness part of it, and Karl, if I may ask you, was the system really ever stable? Or was it always dependent on certain conditions?
I think the system was stable for as long as everybody believed that it was stable. Because while I agree with Nicole that the entire system, of course, came crashing down now in this conflict, I would say the first visible cracks emerged in 2019 when Iran attacked Saudi oil facilities. And something that maybe many of our listeners might not have heard, in the years following, it wasn't just Saudi Arabia that was hit. A number of Arabic Gulf states were hit by drone attacks of, well, either Iranian or Iranian-aligned forces throughout the Middle East. Then we, of course, had the strikes of last summer. We had the strikes on Qatar from both sides, Israel as well as Iran. So, well, to come back to your initial question, yes, the system was probably stable 10 years ago, but it has not really been stable for quite some time.
And do you think that, how do you think this has, like this conflict, changed how the Gulf states think about their own vulnerability, Karl?
Well, I think this conflict, so far until now, with a lot of goodwill from the side of the Arab Gulf states, of the GCC countries, one could have still argued that the US is actually the reliable protector that it claims to be, with a lot of goodwill. However, now in the current situation, I do think that nobody in the GCC area can make this claim with a straight face anymore. So I do think everybody, and definitely every government in the region, has understood that some changes need to happen. But the difficulty, of course, is what are those changes and how can they be achieved?
Let's now, I think, go deeper to the individual sections. And Karl, I want to turn to the structural side of things, of that. And one of the strongest points in the report is that even with shared threats, the Gulf still struggles to act collectively, as you both mentioned in the beginning. But how has this conflict exposed the actual structural weaknesses in the Gulf security?
I mean, the structural weaknesses that have been exposed is the fact. I do think the structural weaknesses in the current system have been exposed by the fact that the war, which the GCC countries did not want, still managed to create an enormous damage, mostly economical, but also from a political perspective. It showcased the inability of the GCC countries to ensure, well, first of all, their safety, the safety of their citizens, the safety of their airspace, the safety of their oil supply and gas supply to much of the world. Now, when it comes to, well, how has it exposed the future security system? Well, that's very difficult to say because the future security system has not yet been, well, it's a thing of the future, obviously. However, if you don't mind, I could make some predictions here.
Yeah.
For example, well, some people argue that the GCC countries will increase their cooperation, and this might happen in some limited areas. However, we should not forget that the threat perception of different GCC countries is very different, as are foreign policy preferences. So, for example, when it comes to Qatar, when it comes to UAE, when it comes to Saudi Arabia or Oman, the damages have been primarily economic as well as a bit political. But if we look at other countries, GCC countries, for example, Kuwait or Bahrain, they see, well, Kuwait has the history of being invaded by its neighbor in the north, and it required a very powerful ally to, well, get rid of the invader. When it comes to Bahrain, we have a Sunni king who rules over a Shia majority country, with reports indicating that Iran has leveraged this, well, potential for the instability repeatedly over the past few years. So in the case of those two countries, the perception might be more of, well, what is essentially at the end of the day a large bill. It can actually conflict with Iran can actually potentially, well, threaten their very sovereignty, their independence, their statehood. For Saudi Arabia, for Qatar, for the UAE, this is less so, also for Oman, obviously. And when it comes, for example, to Qatar, well, yes, the airstrikes from Iran are no doubt a very, very big nuisance. However, it wasn't Iran who imposed a blockade for 3.5 years in the past decade. It was the GCC allies. So I would assume that a leader like we have, like there is in Qatar, would be hesitant to rely too much on these neighbors, on those allies for its own security. Also, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, for example, they have had a very big rift that has become ever bigger over the past few years. Long gone are the days when we thought Saudi Arabia and the UAE are inseparable. So, yes, of course, well, cooperating with other third countries are an option, but the appetite for cooperating with certain actors outside of the region or even within the region are very different depending on the country. So here we will see some obvious limitations.
Thank you. This was actually my next question. I wanted to ask what really prevents, what are the deeper preventations of the cooperation between the GCC members? But why has the region struggled to move from really the coordination to real defense integration within the GCC? If it really supports their defense system in such case?
The question is still addressed to me?
Yes.
Well, I would argue because relying on the US can be very uncomfortable, as we see currently. However, the chance that the US the biggest threat in geopolitics are usually your neighbors. And the willingness to rely for your own security on your neighbors, especially when you have a very big power disparity. You have Saudi Arabia, which is, as well in economics, in population, in country size, much larger than all of its neighbors. Well, I do understand why some GCC countries might be hesitant to engage very deeply with Saudi Arabia in security, also because Saudi Arabia has in the past decade shown repeatedly its willingness to apply force to achieve foreign policy goals. So it's not that we have Iran on the one side as it is an aggressor in a sense, but it's not we have an aggressive Iran and a benevolent Saudi Arabia, UAE. We have aggressive countries everywhere, and relying on the US as a foreign, guarantor basically can, of course, seem attractive.
But then what actually would be achievable in the long term in the Gulf? And what would you say would be a realistic Gulf security architecture, and how would it look like?
What is achievable within the Gulf itself? Well, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, all of these countries, Oman as well, to a lesser extent, but as well, are rich countries. They can invest in weapons research, in R&D. However, but since you mentioned longer term, I'm going to give you a longer term answer. The development of,
Apologies, a short term and a longer term, so both would be great.
Okay, so in the longer term, the countries can start to develop their own weapons. However, even countries with very advanced weapon industries, such as the US, Russia, China, France, they usually take decades to develop air defenses, air forces, etc. In the shorter term, the countries can, of course, try to hedge and balance with multiple foreign partners. For example, they can try and buy part of their equipment from the US. They can try to also start hosting, for example, Chinese bases and buy Chinese equipment. However, here, of course, it should not be forgotten that the US has in the past repeatedly applied significant pressure to prevent such deals from taking place. For example, I think it was in the UAE where an alleged Chinese naval base was scrapped in the end. Whether or not it is actually scrapped is, open for debate. Over concerns of the Americans. We've had the US pressure countries like Egypt, for example, when they were trying to buy Russian weaponry, as they pressured Indonesia when they tried to buy Russian or Chinese weaponry. So, of course, here the GCC countries can try to diversify. And in some instances, for example, if the countries move towards France, there will probably be less pushback from the US. But in the short to midterm, I think that's the only feasible way forward, even though very severe limitations will remain.
So you would say this long-term dependence on external power is still not fully unavoidable?
The long-term dependence, no, if the regional countries, even by themselves, put their mind behind it. Short to mid-term, I do think it is unavoidable.
But would a style like a NATO-style Gulf defense system be realistic?
I personally don't see it, at least not in the midterm, and also long-term, because, NATO, if you look at how NATO came to be in Western Europe, you had countries like Germany and France who have hated each other for centuries. You've had countries like Britain and France who've hated each other even longer. And the only reason why they united was the threat of a Soviet invasion. Now, while Iran is a very powerful country, and it has shown this, I do not think countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE actively fear a ground invasion of Iranian troops onto their soil. So the threat is to an extent manageable. The threat is much larger than many assumed, but it is still manageable without getting cobbled up without the need to actually form a formal alliance with countries that, we shouldn't forget Saudi Arabia bombed a UAE ship in Yemen a few months ago. So they are, to an extent, actively fighting each other. So I do not think that in the midterm this will change. Now, of course, what happens in 30 years, I do not know. But in the short to midterm, no, I do not see it happen.
Finally,
just one more thing, I'm sorry. Even with NATO, you brought up NATO. During the Cold War, and even now, NATO was credible because of the US presence. Mainly. Not just because the Europeans joined together, it was the Americans. So what is the question at the end of the day? Yes, the GCC countries could join together, but they would most likely still require a foreign backer for the defensive posture to be credible.
I think we go back again to the external power dependence. Just final question, Karl, is do you think the internal divisions, you mentioned the UAE and Saudi, for example, but also those internal divisions still matter here with a different threat perception, past tensions, especially things like the Qatar blockade. It wasn't like a long time ago, if you remember.
So yes, of course, threat perceptions can change over time. And if the threat perception of the Gulf, of the GCC countries towards Iran would become much more severe, this could, of course, change. However, decades of sanctions, economic crises in Iran, I do not see the threat of an Iranian ground invasion on any of the Gulf states as realistic. So the threat that we have now is probably also the threat that's going to stay, which is, well, airstrikes. And I do think the Gulf will be able to wither them and withstand them. However, even if we look now, for air defenses, the Gulf states go to the US. Now there is Ukrainian support, but I would argue it was probably US pressure or US influence at least that brought the Ukrainians to the Gulf. So yes, and then if we look at other foreign actors that have decent air defenses, well, you have the Russians, but they are quite busy at the moment and they are close to Iran. You have the Chinese, which usually try not to get involved in such matters, at least historically. You have the US, which obviously. You have Israel, and some GCC countries might actually choose to work with Israel. I do think for countries like Saudi Arabia or Qatar, this will remain very unpalatable and they will not engage with Israel in the defense sector. Then you have the French. You can go with the French. You can go with the British to an extent. However, there, of course, also the question is of industrial capacity. Do those countries, they might have the know-how, but do they have the industrial base to provide air defense in sufficient numbers to GCC countries in case of crisis, especially currently that a lot of European air defense are going to Ukraine because Europe sees Ukraine as a much bigger threat to them than what's going on in the Gulf. So it's just the options are very, very limited. And yes, so I do think at least in the short to mid-term, we will see a continuing reliance on the US.
Thank you very much, Karl, for the insight on the structural side and also for the predictions. Nicole, I want to bring in the legal side now because the report makes it clear this isn't just a security issue. It's also putting pressure on international law. So how is this conflict challenging existing legal frameworks, especially around civilian protection?
Yes, so actually the Iran crisis has several legal layers. First of all, because the challenge is that the coercion is indirect. So the legal framework is clearer if you have one state just attacking one state directly. But it's more difficult when we see that one state pressures a third state in order to influence the behavior of an external protector like the US. So to state, like in the UN Charter, specifically under the Article 2, Paragraph 4, it prohibits the threat or the use of force against any territorial integrity of any state. And Article 51, though, allows individual or collective self-defense in an armed attack. So now the difficulty is like to define what exactly the object of the attack is. So if Iranian actions target the GCC territory, or maybe even shipping infrastructure or oil infrastructure because of US presence, then the GCC states may be victims of such unlawful forces, even if the political message behind it was to direct it to the US. So that matters because like the legal injury is suffered by the Gulf and not by the US. So that's where the difficulty comes in. So even if it affects self-defense, a GCC state could potentially invoke self-defense if the threshold of an armed attack is met. But here, the problem is that the response must still satisfy like the necessity test and the proportionality test of such self-defense. So the involvement of the US inside that complicates the justification because it can like collective self-defense could be invoked, but it can also at the same time increase the escalation risk. So the legal issues are not like whether the force can be occurred, but it's more like how can we deal with that law of coercion if it's indirectly occurred and through a third party. So that's like the first layer. But then there is another layer, which is the layer of the law of the sea. So as we have the Strait of Hormuz being de facto closed, the law of the sea was an issue centrally because Iran put pressure on the Gulf, not only in the territory, but also on the maritime choke points. So the problem is that the Strait of Hormuz was always used as an international navigation. And under the UN clause, all transit passage are means of freedom of navigation and overflight for continuous and like expeditious transits. And all states bordering those straits cannot actually hamper with those transit passage because they fall under international law. And there cannot be any suspension of those transit passages. This is why such a closure or obstruction or even a seizure is illegal. So it is illegal not only because the coastal states are affected, but because it's globally affected and third states are affected, global shipping is affected, energy markets are affected. So basically that's two layers we have when it comes to international law within this conflict.
But when it's affecting it, and then we see the implications of targeting the infrastructure and also in the Strait of Hormuz, the maritime and also all the ships and the energy ports, airports, even desalination systems. What are the implications of that?
Like you mean? Can you repeat?
Legally,
like, implications
legally, what are the implications of targeting such things and breaking the
okay.
yeah?
Yeah, I see. So, like, whenever you attack such an infrastructure, first of all, those infrastructures were civilian infrastructure, which is already prohibited in international law, more specifically in international humanitarian law. When it comes to airports and ports and everything that is used by civilians, you cannot attack them. You can attack military infrastructure but only if a necessity test is done, which means basically, is it really necessary to attack this infrastructure to like either protect yourself or to like whenever like there is a war, if it's necessary to really attack this infrastructure, would it bring you anything politically speaking? So that's the first test you have to make. And then the second test is the proportionality test. So is it proportionate to the means and to the objective of that attack? In all cases, Iranians' attack on GCC infrastructure were illegal because there will always civilian included. If they claim to have only attacked where U.S. presence was seen, then it is a false justification because the impacts were broader than that. And also in international humanitarian law, there is always this mandatory rule of notification. So Iran had to notify those infrastructures or bases before their attack, which was not the case. In some scenarios, we had cases where they would notify, but that was not the general rule applied of Iran.
And also when the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz, if we can say, it also affected civilians because the global energy price have shifted with that, I guess. So just let's shift a bit, and if I may ask you, I think here we are seeing international law weakening in practice, even if it is still exists on paper. What would you say on that?
So basically, it's a bit difficult or a bit also critical to say that international law or norms are shifting because, like, as we know, like the rules are set, the rules are unchanged, the rules exist. So we have the rules of the UN Charter, and under Article 2, Paragraph 4, we have the the right of self-defense also under Article 51. We have the necessity test, we have the proportionality test, we have the principles of sovereignty, the non-intervention principles, even the law of sea, like we have all those rules. The problem is that those legal characterizations are misused in the conduct of practice. So if we take the example of self-defense, like states are increasingly confronted with like actions that sit at the margins of that threshold of when we can use the self-defense or not. So, for example, whenever we have like interferences with commercial shippings or attacks on energy infrastructure, even cybersecurity, the threshold is very debated because the key legal question is whether and when such conduct are considered as armed attacks. So that's what is defined under Article 51, right? So nowadays it's just difficult to set that threshold under what is considered as armed attacks. And that's where the issue falls in. Every state interprets this notion of armed attacks differently, and that's also where state practice diverge. Secondly, if you talk about like the attribution of the law, the conduct is attributable to a state where there is a sufficient control. That means like when you know that, for example, Iran had the goal of attacking the US, but went through the GCC. So it's a bit difficult to set the attribution of the law because you don't know the intent of the state. And there again, it's about the interpretation. When it comes to the law of the sea, the legal regime is also set. It's clear. Any transit passage through international straits must not be impeded and must not be suspended. So the interference with navigation in the Strait of Hormuz therefore raised serious legal issues as we observed it. Like sometimes the states treat it as politically rather than legally. So this is also where it breaches a lot of navigational rights. So all in all, I would not consider it as a transformation, but more as a fragmentation in their application. There is no consistency and also no legal predictability because every state has a fragmented view of their application, basically.
But could we say now, after especially this conflict, like this conflict can actually reshape how international law is interpreted in future wars? Because each side of this conflict is interpreting it in a different way and gives themselves the right to target different sites.
Yeah, unfortunately, the use of international law being misused or misinterpreted, that we saw already in a lot of wars, and it's a reoccurring issue. But I think what is different now is maybe that international law is used as an instrument even in this war. Like, for example, the threat of the US interfering in the strait or blocking the strait itself was very interesting to see because what Iran did was already illegal, but what the US threatened to do was also illegal. So they're playing with international law, they're playing and misusing international law as a tool of war, which is something that is maybe transformed through that Iran-US war. So Yeah, I would not say that this war specifically will transform international law, but the interesting part is that they use it as a tool of war.
Yeah, but I think especially this war have shifted a lot of global powers, and also especially the energy. The GCC is the source of energy for many countries, and like I think here we can definitely ask if this issue, are they the rules themselves? Some would say no, but I want to hear from you, and also or the fact they're not being enforced consistently is the issue, and who would enforce it?
So the enforcement of international law was always the main issue of why law is not working. But at the same time, we need to understand international law is different from national law because there is no enforcement mechanism in as such. So basically, the enforcement mechanism comes from the states. So the states firstly need to implement international law in their national law. Only if that happens, international law can actually be applied. So you cannot, we cannot say that there must be an enforcement mechanism of international law because international law was created by states and it's for states. And basically, if a state doesn't sign a treaty, it means the state doesn't need to apply that law. It's just how international law functions. And here it's important to mention again, it's the principle of good faith. So normally, states must always act in good faith. And this can only apply if a state actually is willing to adapt the international law existing already in their national law. And I only see a future going forward if we embed all those principles in the national law and then apply it nationally, and then automatically it would be also applied internationally.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for giving us the insights and also your analysis on the legal side. I think listening to both of you, it feels like your sections and your expertise are not really separate in this issue. And I would like to ask you both, starting with Karl, would you say this is both a structural breakdown and a legal breakdown happening at the same time? And do weak regional system make legal protection harder to enforce?
I do think it's a structural and the legal breakdown at the same time, but it's not the first time we have seen it. We have seen the structural and the legal breakdown in the past few years, in the war in Ukraine, in the wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We have seen it with Palestine and Israel. We see it here. So yes, it is a structural and a legal breakdown at the same time, but it's by no means the first, and I do not think it will be the last. And you can say yes to that if you assume that the regional structure, if it is strong, is interested in implementing the law. However, you can, of course, have a more pessimistic view, which I think I've shared quite a lot this evening, which is that a strong power might not necessarily have an interest in implementing the rule of law, or it might only have an interest in implementing the rule of law when others break it, but not you yourself. So yes, you need, of course, good structures if you want good structures, or a lot of power if you want to implement the law. However, a good structure or a lot of power in itself is no guarantee whatsoever that international law will be implemented. And we should not forget there is an instrument to implement international law, and it's called the UN Security Council. And I think most of us are not too happy with its performance over the past few decades.
What would your insights be, Nicole?
So I'll start with the second question, actually. For example, if we take the GCC, they never had the goal of being a supranational cooperation. So they already implied that every state has a sovereign say. So it doesn't mean that they want to be intragovernmental, like the EU, for example, where they have a strong legal system. as a cooperation. So, for example, these systems are very different already from the beginning. It doesn't mean that the GCC is weaker in applying international law than the EU just because they have different sovereignty. I do think like weaker regional systems, they have nothing to do with international law being applied. That's, as I said before, I think that comes from each state individually. And I think that comes, sorry.
Sorry, the second part, what I meant here,
Yeah.
in such system, the legal protection, so protecting the GCC, does this matter? Because it's a weaker system, or the essence is not weaker, you think, and so it doesn't matter for the legal protection as well?
No, like, I don't know if I understand it correctly, because in my vision, the essence is already differently when it comes to the legal protection.
Okay.
So, like, for me personally, national implementation was and will always be the most important factor of international law enforcement. Karl mentioned the UN Security Council. Again, as a lot of people would claim, it's not working very efficiently because we still have the P5s with the veto power, which is very outdated when we look at our times now. The P5s, for example, that was created after the World War, when they actually had, like, when the power was shifted with them and when the vision was different than we have it now. The dynamics have shifted, which gives me to say that the UN Security Council is not the main enforcement power of international law nowadays. Neither is the ICJ nor the ICC. Because, again, states, they have to sign a treaty to make it enforceable. So, again, that goes back to what I said before. The nations, the states are the main actors of international law enforcement.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and Karl, for your insights here. Just before ending this part as well of our integrated section, I wanted to ask you both, are Gulf states now in a position where they're exposed to conflict, but don't really control how it escalates?
I do think they are, yes, and they will remain so for the foreseeable future. One could, of course, if one wants to, one can adopt an Iranian argument that, well, if the implicit Iranian argument, if the Gulf states didn't have US bases, they would not be attacked. However, that, of course, would also mean that the GCC countries would have to bow to Iran's wishes, which they will not do, also based on principle. So, yes, I think for the foreseeable future, they will be, well, prone to conflict, prone to be the victims of aggression. And one thing we should not forget, yes, maybe the US and Iran do reach a deal. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, maybe it just kind of fizzles out. However, the current US administration has sadly proven to be not necessarily the most trustworthy negotiator. So even if there is a treaty today, in 2 months, in 5 months, in a year, everything can change again.
Nicole, do you want to have any comments on that?
I just want to add that we live in a world of unpredictability. So unpredictability is something that all states are dealing with at the moment. In particular, the GCC states, and I'm talking especially from UAE perspective. So unpredictability is something they mention a lot in their talks. And it means that the UAE itself, for example, they are now they have a project of resilience, building up resilience. How can the GCC, or in particular the UAE, be most resilient in the time where there is no certainty of protection? They cannot fully rely on the US, but they can also not abandon their partnership. What do? So their vision is to establish new partnerships and especially to be independent. So I think the next step will be that the GCC tries to establish their independence from oil, from security dependence. So I think that will be the step forward to create nationally and independent of external partners. It doesn't mean abandoning those partners, but it does mean stepping up as the GCC and stepping up as individual state. So yeah, that would be my input to that.
Thank you, Nicole. You actually went to our next part as well directly, which the report makes it really clear for us that there is no clean or right option here. It's really a question of managing the risks. And Karl, what options do Gulf states realistically have right now, in your perspective?
Well, I do think in the short to mid-term, they don't have that many options. Yes, they can diversify their foreign partners to an extent. They can increase cooperation with France. They can increase cooperation with the UK. They can increase cooperation with South Korea. However, for air defense, However, we should not forget that especially Britain has always, well, since the Second World War, tried to maintain a very close relationship with the US. South Korea is dependent on the US for defense. So even this diversification, if the US were to pressure those countries to choose, if the US were to try and force those countries not to increase cooperation, which is a scenario that I could foresee happening, I do not think that neither the UK nor South Korea would be willing to give up on their relationship with the US in favor of the Gulf countries. Also, one thing the Gulf countries can, of course, do is they can increase massively their investments in domestic weapons R&D instead of just spending tens and tens of billions every year to buy US-made weaponry. They could try and develop some of their own. This will take time. GCC cooperation in this field, for all the reasons I mentioned before, I do foresee to remain very limited. Some cooperation might, of course, be possible, for example, in joint air defenses towards Iran. Also, some openings might be there. Well, given that the GCC countries do not have a very large defense base, defense industrial base, for example, the drone industry is still relatively new. So a newcomer might have an easier time going at it there. However, defense is not just drones. Defense requires a more holistic approach. And one thing that should not be forgotten, even if the GCC countries look for other partners, foreign partners, if you buy a plane, for example, from any country, you should be quite sure that for the next few decades, your relationship with the country is going to be good. Otherwise, you will not have spare parts, you will not have maintenance. And at that point, it's just a very, very expensive piece of metal. So there are options, but I don't see any short or mid-term remedies for the GCC countries' dependence on the US defense sector.
Thank you very much, Karl. Nicole, is restraint a strategic choice now in the GCC, you think? Or is it being forced on them?
No, as Karl mentioned before, they were put in a situation where which they didn't want at the first place. So they were forced to be in that position, but it is the only realistic position they could be in at this point. So again, I would not claim that they should replace the US overnight, because that's simply not realistic. But they can also not rely fully on that US-led model. Firstly, because the external deterrence will remain. The US and other partners will still matter, because the GCC simply doesn't have a fully autonomous defense architecture yet, and maybe also they won't have in the future. Secondly, the GCC needs to probably have stronger regional coordination, but not in all areas, but in particular areas like the shared air defense systems, even maritime surveillance, and also very importantly, cybersecurity and energy infrastructure. But Also, there has to be a legal and diplomatic layer with Iran, especially because the region is very reliant on Iran. And I'm also talking about the UAE, which has a very high economic relationship with Iran. They have a lot of trade deals and a lot of partnership. So in order for the region to have a mechanism that works in future, they do need to have a de-escalation with Iran. And not only for trade, but also for the maritime protection and the protection of all navigation through those straits they share.
Thank you, Nicole. And on this point, if I can start with Nicole, then also Karl, is we saw the energy prices only in a couple of weeks what happened to them just because of the conflict. So here, how can we analyze this, and what's the most dangerous escalation point? Is it energy? Is it shipping? Water? What would you say of the region on the GCC mainly?
So should I start?
Yeah.
So for the GCC, it's definitely food security, fertilizers. It's not even oil that is the most important layer. It is definitely food security also for the African countries, since a lot of the fertilizers were reduced to ship to Africa. So I think that's the biggest priority and the biggest threat we face. Of course, oil as well, but that's something that doesn't affect the GCC mostly. It's more Asian countries or even Europe. But as we saw recently, the UAE wants to sign off OPEC. So this is also an interesting development in that field, but it also shows the willingness of GCC countries or maybe UAE to be less reliant on oil. And they realize that, especially with the Iran war. But that comes to say that oil and energy is not the biggest issue here, but it is fertilizer and food security.
Thank you, Nicole. Karl?
Yes, I mostly agree with that statement. I mean, the lack of oil exports is expensive, and it's a nuisance. However, I would still argue it's a very big nuisance at the end of the day. Many of the GCC countries have national wealth funds that should be able to, help them get through these difficult times right now. However, if we see a further escalation, the biggest threat, in my perspective, is food security also, but from the perspective of the water desalination. Should the US actually attack Iranian infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and should the Iranians, as a result, keep their promise to attack desalination plants in the Gulf region, that could be truly catastrophic, because many of the Gulf countries rely for a very, very significant portion of their water use. They rely on desalination for that. Also, one thing that I do see as a potential problem, and I'm not quite sure how the GCC countries could solve, especially countries like the UAE or Qatar, is many predominantly Western expats, highly qualified specialists came to the UAE, came to Qatar because the salaries are very good, the taxes are very low, the lifestyle is quite nice. However, there is of course the risk that if the current situation remains as hostile as it is, that some people might decide, I'd rather pay taxes and have guaranteed access to drinking water and food than staying in the Gulf and risking, nightly bombings. So I think those are the two biggest risks. One is short-term, one is long-term for the GCC countries.
Thank you. If you were, this question is for both of you. If you were advising GCC leaders today, what's the least risky path forward, you would say? If I can start with Karl, then Nicole.
Well, I do think the least risky way would probably be, for one, keep, at least for now, the US close, buy their weapons that you need to defend yourself while investing heavily in domestic R&D. At the same time, try to increase the resilience of your infrastructure that circumvent the Strait of Hormuz, so you can all in the long term, if something like this were to repeat itself, you could actually still export your hydrocarbons. However, of course, Saudi Arabia did this to an extent, but with the Saudi ports at the Red Sea, you're within striking distance of the Houthis, which have thankfully so far remained quite quiet, but we don't know what would happen next time. But that's definitely something I would advise, and also try to somehow, I'm not a military expert, but try to somehow guarantee the resilience of your water desalination plants, that it would be increase the difficulty for Iran to take them down in case of a conflict.
Thank you, Karl.
Yeah,
Nicole?
I can definitely just add on. I would also definitely keep the US as a partner, definitely de-escalate the risk with Iran, keep Iran as a partner because it is still the neighbor of the GCC. So it is only diplomatically very recommended to keep Iran as a friendly enemy, if I can say. Then also, I would say invest in private sectors of the GCC to create their own wealth, to diversify their economy as they've been doing already since several years, to still keep on being independent of hydrocarbon, slowly investing in other infrastructure possibilities, creating new trade corridors, as they also have been doing with the rail initiatives they've been building, and and also invest more in the desalination infrastructures. That would be my advice as well.
Thank you both for your advices on the policy point. Looking ahead, the report suggests that the old model that we mentioned in the last hour or so won't survive, but also that won't be replaced overnight. We spoke about the dependency on the UK and the diversification. But here, what would a meaningful regional cooperation actually require?
So it would require to put political interest aside and focus mainly on, realistically speaking, economic developments, because at the end of the day, that's where the cooperation came about, and that's the only way how to maintain cooperation, because at the end of the day, economic interest, it is what keeps them together. And that said, I would say if they could create more investment opportunities, even including Iran, not putting more sanctions on Iran, that would better the situation diplomatically speaking. And then if we speak about security issues, then again, unify, create a strong cooperation together, while maintaining those partnerships with the US, but at the same time keeping Iran as an economic source, because that's the way how to keep things cooperated and collaborated.
Thank you, Nicole. Karl?
Yes, I mostly agree. I mean, the GCC countries would have to put their what is usually foreign policy disputes aside. But for that to happen, I only think this will happen if the GCC countries were to perceive Iran as an existential threat, which I do not think at the moment it is. I do think this might change immediately once desalination plants are hit. But so far, I do not think that so far most of the GCC countries see Iran as a truly existential threat. So it might just be more convenient to continue doing what you've been doing, maybe try to increase your self-reliance a little bit, but without truly fundamental changes that would require, painful or unpopular or, sacrifices. Compromises is the better word, yes.
Thank you, Karl, as well. So to close, I want to ask both of you one final question. What is one thing policymakers are currently getting wrong about the Gulf security, and what should they be doing differently? If you would like to start, Karl, then Nicole.
Whose policymakers?
Sorry?
We have 190. Which policymakers? We have
GCC.
194 GCC policymakers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think they're getting that much wrong. It's just
GCC Americans as well.
Well, the Americans, I do think the current administration got a lot of things wrong. A lot of assumptions were wrong about how quickly Iran would, capitulate. For the GCC countries currently, I do not think they're making that many mistakes. However, they're not really in a position to do that much at the moment either. They made the mistakes in the past to rely too strongly on the US without increasing their own capacities independently or as a group. Yes. Well, I do think that especially the policymakers in the GCC countries, they lack the ability right now to act in a way that would actually benefit them. And these are mistakes of the past that will take many, many years, if not decades, but most likely decades to fix.
Thank you, Karl.
Yeah, I can only add on what Karl already mentioned. I mean, the dependency is actually how the GCC came about. I mean, they were always dependent on one partner or one actor at least. If it's security or economy, that doesn't matter. But the dependency is something that GCC states were trying to get rid of. But I think they didn't expect it to be as fast as it came about with this war. And because they were so reliant on the US, definitely it was something that policymakers couldn't expect. Again, like it was unexpected. But they are recovering, and I know that the UAE, they are already in talks on building a more independent, autonomous military system and investing more in research, military research, cyber defense, all of that. So if there is one thing that the policymakers can do is really invest in research, national research, and all those security fields.
If I may, I think also one thing that the GCC policymakers could do, they might be doing, and I'm just not seeing it, is they could try to invest more in, let's call it lobbying within Washington, to try that in the future, Gulf interests are more taken into account. However, that only works, of course, if you have, a predictable or rational, or however you want to call it, person at the head of the United States. But the US has in the past repeatedly, or Israel is oftentimes declared to be the special partner of the US in the Middle East. Overcoming this special relationship would be very difficult, but I do not, and maybe even impossible, but even if replacing the role of Israel in the US is impossible, which I do think it is, I do think the current war is against the national interests of the US. So you would actually not even necessarily have to have as much influence in Washington as Israel does. You just need enough influence that the US politicians who represent US interests combined with the influence of the Gulf states would be strong enough to overcome Israeli influence. But even that might be quite a high bar.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Karl. And thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you both. This has been a really valuable discussion and helps unpack what is a very complex moment for the region. For listeners, this conversation accompanies MEA Institute's special edition report From Pattern to Partner, Rethinking Gulf Defense After the Iran War. Karl, Nicole, thank you again for joining.
That was Karl Theus and Nicole Weber, taking us on a deep dive into GCC defense. Thank you for listening to Access and Arc, a production of the MEA Institute for Strategic Studies. If you enjoyed this conversation, follow and share the podcast and subscribe for strategic insights and deeper analysis delivered straight into your inbox. You'll find all the links and ways to engage with us in the show notes. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.